Welcome to the 5th Annual Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, held April 29th and 30th, 2000, on the campus of UCLA. This is tape number 52.
So we're going to begin, and our moderator, our well-dressed moderator, will be slipping into the middle seat, and Steve Wasserman is the editor of the LA Times Book Review, who's right here, apparently, and is getting an introduction from me. See? Please welcome our esteemed book editor, Steve Wasserman.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your patience. I have to click something on? Oh, shit. Over here. Zachary. At least two of us are technologically impaired or challenged.
Yes.
What, do we have to do this because our words are going
so that you are heard.
Terrific. How's this? Can people hear me? Great. First, thank you for waiting, and I apologize for my late entrance. Reading all night keeps one up, and so one tries to catch up on sleep during the odd hours of the morning. And it is a rather odd hour of the early Sunday morning, and so again, thank you for coming to the second day of the 5th Annual Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, which is, for us at the Times, a huge pleasure to organize, not self-servingly, because it provides for us a kind of oxygen which we inhale throughout the rest of the year, and it tends to embolden us to do the right thing, or at least attempt to do the right thing week after relentless week, knowing that there really are readers out there and people who believe that ideas matter, and that, I think, perhaps affords me a segue into what I will try to concoct as the actual subject of this discussion, history's elusive truths. I can speak very candidly right now about a matter which I was constrained earlier on over the course of the last 18 months not to speak about publicly, since I like to be employed, and I thought if I did so I might risk my job. The departed publisher of the Los Angeles Times, one Catherine Downing, not previously known for any newspaper experience, but who had been catapulted by virtue of her strong vertebrae into the position of publisher. I happened to have had lunch with her shortly after her appointment, and we began talking about this and that, and the subject of the book review somehow made its way into our conversation. And naturally, since I'm someone whose DNA makes me perpetually anxious about almost everything, I wondered how she liked what she read in the book review. And she looked at me a little puzzled and said, well, to tell you the truth, I think it's my impression that you're reviewing a lot of history books. And I said, well, I hadn't really thought about it, but now that you mention it, I suppose I have been reviewing a lot of history books. And then she looked at me and she said, well, maybe it's just me, but I'm really not much interested in history. Unfortunately, I had neither the temerity nor the wit to look at her very evenly and said, well, don't you think you ought to go into another line of work? Because rather famously, history is said, or has been said to be or journalism has been said to be the first draft of history. What do you mean you're not interested in history? It's what we do. However well or badly, I mean, feebly every day, trying to make the attempt to deliver up what, by the next day, along with the proverbial fish in which it's wrapped, some sense of what historical events that might be consuming us as we live day to day are up to. The topic today, history's elusive truths, can perhaps be evaluated from many different perspectives. We have, to my far right, Thomas Flanagan, a very distinguished author of novels and past professor at multiple universities, both the University of California at Berkeley and at, I believe it was Brown University, is that? Stony Brook, excuse me, of English literature, whose criticisms and critiques are unfailingly incisive, and who wields a marvelously felicitous pen. He's with us. Zachary Carable, a writer of many talents, who has been reviewing quite steadily for a number of publications, and who has a new book just out from Alfred A. Knopf on Harry Truman and the election of 1948. And to my immediate left, Orville Schell, currently Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at University of California at Berkeley, and the author of many books on China, as well as, I suppose, a somewhat neglected, two neglected books, at least I think not as widely known as his work on China. One, a kind of study of Jerry Brown when he was governor of the state of California, and another book, if memory serves, on the meat industry and cattle raising.
You have a good memory, Steve.
Yeah, and when he's not doing that, the beef that he grows, the Shell Neiman beef, which can be had at the finer restaurants of the Bay Area, as in Chez Panisse and others, we can also credit to his exquisite taste and general elegance. And finally, to my extreme left is Peter Novick, who teaches at University of Chicago. Is that correct? And whose most recent book is a book which, at least in some quarters, is quite controversial, and in other quarters has been greeted with relief that at last someone has had the courage to tackle this very difficult and morally fraught subject. A book with, even the title alone perhaps says it all, The Holocaust in American Life, published by Houghton Mifflin. Is that memory serves? Well, we thought we'd assemble this rather eclectic group to examine a number of questions which really do have to do with the somewhat porous boundary between fiction, in one sense, and history. Increasingly, ever since the Annales school in France really broke apart the older notions of straightforward narrative history, which tried to make a kind of single coherent narrative or story out of various events, it has become increasingly abundant to us as the last century unfolded and as now this century dawns that history can be told from many points of view, and that it is a kind of tapestry whose strands are a variety of truths which, taken together, perhaps give us some sense of the whole cloth, but which of the colors in that tapestry deserve or cry out for attention, and which others fade into the background, and to what extent a single author can himself or herself actually be entrusted with the extraordinarily responsible task of deciding upon the proportions, and to what extent can documents and oral evidence be sifted and weighed, and where is the truth in all of that, in a world which increasingly is skeptical of all texts, all documents, all so-called eyewitnesses, and in which the notion of relativism itself seems so ubiquitous and so politically and morally charged that many people have come to doubt whether history itself can actually ever be properly written itself. There is, on the one side, those sorts of questions, and then I suppose on the other side are the truths, history's truths as reflected in works of fiction. And I would not like to exclude that, because over the years, as I have in my home, one wall of books, sort of thousands of books on one wall and thousands of books on the other. On one wall is sort of Plato to NATO, sort of history. On the other wall is fiction, A to Z, from the Arabian Nights to Zamayatan. And as I've grown older, and maybe this is just a question of age, I don't want to mistake the inexorable advance of age for actual maturity, but it does appear to me from time to time, people used to come into the home and they would say, well, have you read all these books? I said, well, yes, some, mostly, and some I've read more than once, and others, like One's Good China, I only take out on special occasions, and others I've never read at all, but hope one day actually to read. And so, but of them all, I used to say, well, one side was truth and the other side were, well, those were the lies wonderfully told. The truth at that time, I thought, was the so-called wall of nonfiction and history, and of course the lies were those wonderful things called novels. Well, as I've gotten older, I've increasingly come to think that, well, no, I got it exactly wrong. On one side are sort of the comforting myths that we've told ourselves, trying to make sense of the disorderly nature of human life as it's actually lived, and on the other side, these novels. Well, these are the things that have captured history's enduring, if elusive, truths. So why don't we open this up in a kind of free-range way to a few minutes of conversation. We'll start with Professor Flanagan. We'll go to Carol, to Shell, to Novik, and we'll open it up to questions, see where it leads us.
I think we can demonstrate the elusiveness of truth right at the outset, and there may not be any need for further discussion. If you have consulted the program for our festival, you will see that I am the author of a book on a 19th century Canadian rebel, half Indian and half French, named Louis Real. I did not write this book. Thomas Flanagan wrote the book, but a different Thomas Flanagan. And we are wedded forever in this. There was once a third Thomas Flanagan who published tips on horse racing. And I sent away for the book, but it was worse than useless. But I also sent away for the other Thomas Flanagan's book, and it's a very good book indeed. I would recommend it to you. The Canadians made a television miniseries of it. That is to say, the French Canadians did, so it is in French, and most Canadians couldn't understand it, which is pretty much the story of that community. What I did was to write 3 historical novels, all about Ireland, one in the end of the 18th century, one in the middle of the 19th century, and the third at the early 20th century, during what the Irish call the War of Independence, with their well-known sense of humor. I think I've had a long time to think about this question of the truth of history and the truth of fiction. Aristotle, as I said, that poetry is truer than history because it is more universal. Or at least a graduate student who took down Aristotle's notes has him saying that. We have no way of knowing what Aristotle said, so we're back with the illusion of history. So I'll back away with that.
I want to get into this question by telling a brief set of stories about Governor Thomas Dewey, who ran against Harry Truman in the 1948 election. Governor Dewey was the chief executive of New York State and had run for president in 1944 and had done pretty well against Franklin Roosevelt, and so was seen as a credible challenger and a credible candidate in 1948 and someone who would lead the Republicans back to the White House. The thing about Dewey at the time, and even more since, is the degree to which he was extremely opaque. It was very difficult to know who Thomas Dewey was, who the real man was behind the image of him that was presented in the campaign by his managers, by his staff. Dewey, in a lot of ways, is the first packaged candidate, the first person who constructs an image so as to win an election in a very rigorous way, care of Poles and ad men from Madison Avenue. And even at the time, there were people who found Dewey very difficult to get a hold of. There's a very famous quip by Alice Roosevelt Longworth that he looks like the little man on top of the wedding cake. He was also known as having a smile for all weathers. Things could be bad, things could be terrible, and he'd always have this delightful, somewhat elliptical smile, which someone called his China doll smile that never wore off. His campaign speeches were lovely, lofty platitudes. In fact, one reporter said that his speeches were so lofty that they never touched ground at any specific point. Someone else remarked that Thomas Dewey all he had to do is come out with an endorsement of an early spring, a late fall, or a stern denunciation of the man-eating shark, and that was the extent of his specificity during the campaign. Now, the problem is when you begin to write about someone like this, a man who took extreme pains to make sure that whatever was spontaneous, perhaps a little bit dangerous in the sense that it could lose him support or gain him support, he made sure to smooth over those edges so as that not to be seen. What do you do with someone like that when you sit down to write the story of someone like that? Now, this is a question biographers get into all the time, but one of the reasons why there's only been one prominent biography of Thomas Dewey since his death is that Thomas Dewey is almost impossible to grasp hold of. And it's always tempting when you're writing a story and faced with a figure like this to try to add life to him, to try to spice up the anecdotes, to give this person some sort of flesh and blood that you and I can relate to in reading it. But that temptation is somewhat dangerous because then you try to create a character where there may in fact, because of the nature of history or the nature of the person, not be one that's readily accessible. And I think what we need to do in situations like that in terms of the elusiveness of the past is honor this opacity. Honor the degree to which it's difficult to grasp hold of people in retrospect. Sometimes it's impossible to grasp hold of people when you're actually talking to them. And not to try to add life, but in some way to incorporate that into the story that we're writing. Because the world is full of people who are difficult to access. I mean, Thomas Dewey, in retrospect, is like one of those building models from the late 60s that we now, we look at in the urban landscape and we go, oh my God, that is so, did that ever look good? The what were they thinking question. And when you're faced with that, I think sometimes you need to just allow for that to sit there and weave its way, certainly for me as a writer, into the narrative in a way that's compelling, but also from the perspective of a reader to allow for that mystery, because that's part of the experience all of us have daily alive. And so it ought to be part of the experience we have in writing about the past, because it fills it out, I think, in a much more organic fashion. So I will leave it at that.
Well, personally, I'm very happy that there is a book review that has a historical mind, and I think the LA Times book review is curiously one of the most, if not the most interesting book review in America, precisely because it does have these kinds of roots. I've been occupied the last 5 years in a curious undertaking, which really is, when this subject was presented, I knew this was precisely the panel that I ought to be on. Because I've been working on a subject which has attracted to it enormous amounts of projection over the last 200 years, and that is Tibet. And it is a subject that is somewhere between fiction and history, because in our minds, our imagined version of this place, what I finally called virtual Tibet, is very, very different from the real place. It's even very, very different from how the Chinese imagine Tibet. And just very quickly, I want to just show you these two projections. Just tick down a list, because you can see it's the same place seen through two very different eyes, and it's absolutely different. Now, when the Chinese looked at Tibet, what did they see? This is the Chinese Communist Party. They saw a feudal society, oppressive, theocratic, the persecuted peasants that had serfs that were maintained by aristocrats and by monasteries. They saw a society gravely in need of being turned over, revolutionized, and remade, begging, yearning indeed for Mao Zedong's liberation, which was an exterior liberation, not an interior Buddhist form of liberation. And I think China's never quite understood that Tibet, really, that wasn't what liberation was about in Tibet. And they never quite figured out that they weren't their form of liberation as they imagined it. And their interpretation of Tibetan history was not well received in Tibet. And it's created a terrible problem, as you all know. Now, we, on the other hand, in the West,
We've had a very different version. We've imagined Tibet as a land of spiritual density, redemption, with enormous transformative powers. We think of it as a place that's not dedicated to making Buicks, but good karma. You know, meditation, not manufacturing. We look at the mountains, the Himalayas, the purity, the sort of the almost sacred quality, cathedral-like quality of these natural landforms. And that helps us also imbue Tibet with this sort of wealth of spiritual meaning and spiritual power. And that is very much part of our projection today, that we wanted to believe that there was a land apart back in the Second World War, when just before it, when Lost Horizon came out. We pined to know that there was some place on the globe that stood apart, that was humane, that was sensible, that was spiritual, and that wasn't going to be caught up in the Holocaust. And from that time on, it was like a snowball that rolled and rolled and rolled and gathered more and more a sense of mystery, of magic, of spirituality, of being that privileged utopian sanctuary apart from the hurly-burly of the fallen state of grace of the Western modern world that we all knew. Now, it's not that most of us will ever go there, but we just like to know that there is such a place in case we want to go there. But the reality of Tibet is very different. It's cold. It's dirty. There's no good food. There are no flush toilets. You know, there are no trees to speak of. It's a very, very harsh life. And it's tremendously, I think it bespeaks of our tremendous yearning to believe in certain kinds of places onto which we project our yearnings, that we have been able to transform Tibet, this barren, isolated place, into something that is so affecting for us, and so meaningful, and so full of promise. And in a sense, it is a different form of history, and it is history in its most obvious form, where we, the historians, in a sense, project onto the subject what we would like to see it become.
The title, History's Elusive Truths, plural, to be sure. I don't know whether that was... The plural was intentional or not.
After the fact, I claim everything as intentional. Even when the great goddess Serendipity is shining her face down upon us.
You know, as the remarks of some of the people here have indicated, this word truth gets used in different ways. Obviously, when you talk about the truths of poetry, you're not talking about this kind of correspondence theory of truth in which what is said is true if it corresponds to something out there. There's a somewhat fuzzier notion, I think, in the notion of truths in poetry. When we talk about, usually, about whether a history is telling the truth or not, or whether one account is truer than another, we seem to be saying, using it in this correspondence sense of truth. There was stuff that happened back then, and the historian tries to replicate it in Leopold von Ranke's famous phrase, tell it the way it really was. I don't think that this is a reasonable aspiration for an historical work. Truth, it seems to me, in this correspondence sense, you can even pick at it in the small sense I'm going to talk about, is a characteristic of sentences. There's a bottle of water in front of me, that's true. There's a bottle of Chardonnay in front of me, that sentence is not true. Recently had a court case in England, you may have read about, David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt, in which Irving said, among other things, there were not gas chambers in Auschwitz, in which hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. That sentence was false, and done to elaborate it. And so sentences, or things expressible in sentences, can, in fact, in our workaday sense of the word, be talked about as true or not. When you talk about book-length synthetic accounts of complex events, accounts which inevitably pick out some finite number of hopefully true statements from the zillions that you could possibly make. And this selection is obviously terribly important. And there's no criterion of truth about which ones you pick out, because they're all out there. And you got to arrange them in some kind of way. And it's manifest that you can arrange them in a lot of different ways. The only way that our common everyday use of the word truth could be applied to such an account is if you believe that certain of these facts are the ones that sort of manifestly are the relevant ones and the others are irrelevant, that history happened in stories. Well, it doesn't happen in stories because there's all this cross-cutting stuff happening at the same time. So I think in this everyday sense of the word of correspondence, the notion that a certain account is the truth about something or approaches the truth about something or is truer than some other simply doesn't make any sense. It's applying this word in a realm in which it doesn't apply. Its proper range of application is things I don't want to turn this into a law, but things characteristically expressible in sentences. Some people are dismayed by this and equate this with the view that one view is as good as another, some sort of caricature of some unreal relativism. It's not true that one view is as good as another. You can make all kinds of critical comparative remarks about two historical accounts. I won't go into it. I don't want to take all that time. But with respect, I'm suggesting that it's probably a mistake to think of the truth about the past in this correspondence sense as something worth aspiring toward, because it's not just elusive in practice, it's elusive in principle. It's not something to be had.
So would one say that in order to get at the truth, we would have to embrace many truths?
No. I am saying that the use of the word truth as applied to the past is you're using an inappropriate term. It's not.
So
your notion is incoherent.
So Walter Cronkite, like von Ranke, was wrong when he said, "And that's the way it was."
Oh yes, he was indeed.
I wanted to add a little kind of anecdote to Orville's shell, which is both just amusing and therefore gratuitous, but also bears on the point. Henry Wallace ran for president in 1948, and Henry Wallace had also been Secretary of Agriculture in 1933, and was a, quirky, unusual guy when it came down to it in the political scene. Although he had also one of the richest political candidates of that era, because he had invented a strain of corn hybrid that made him a lot of money. And in 1933, he apparently, and emphasis on the apparently, sent a man who he had met, who was a white Russian painter, quasi-mystic, named Nicholas Roerich, on the Secretary of Agriculture's dime to an expedition to Mongolia, purportedly to find a strain of drought-resistant grain that would, be helpful to farmers in the Midwest, but in point of fact, to find the mystical origins of the Buddhist kingdom of Shambhala in, of all places, Tibet. And so Roerich, again, being funded by the U.S. government in 1933, spends a year on an expedition trying to find the Buddhist kingdom of Shambhala and goes into Tibet in order to do so. And Wallace, who was understandably concerned that this would in fact become public knowledge, created a code where he addressed Roerich as Dear Guru and signed it, your loving servant Galahad, I hope that you have found luck in finding the 7 stones. And he referred to Roosevelt as the flaming one, and he referred to Churchill as the roaring lion. Now, of course, these letters became public in 1948, as these letters always do. Why people don't destroy letters like this is one of the great mysteries and joys of being a historian. And Westbrook Pegler, who was a columnist for the Chicago Syndicate, raised these letters and said, "Dear Mr. Wallace, could you please address these guru letters?" Now, what's interesting about this is it's not at all clear in light of history that these were factual, whether or not, Wallace never actually claims that he didn't write it, but whether or not this actually went on as it was purported remains a question. But the fact that it was not refuted and it's murky enough means that as a reality of a later campaign and as a story that I've just told, it's entered the realm, if not of truth, and certainly part of the that tapestry of history that we talk about.
Let's open it up to some questions, because I do want to allow enough time for you all to express these questions. And would you please use the microphone, because the session is being taped.
Yeah. I have the question for Mr. Carabell on the 1948 election. I wonder what you think of the theory that one of the biggest mistakes of the experts in that election was to say that Truman couldn't win, and the continuing myth today to say that it was very hard for Truman to win because of the Democratic Party splits. And the reason I raise the question of it being a mistake or a myth is the other theory that because of the segregationist split, it helped Truman get votes of those people who felt strongly about civil rights, and because of the Wallace split on the left, it helped Truman get votes of moderates and people who felt strongly against communism, because Truman was portrayed in the relative sense of being more of a moderate and anti-communist.
You did that very well. Yes. So I say, the only thing that's more elusive than the past is the present. And to some degree, what went on in 1948 was fully evocative of how impossible it is to actually know what's going on right now, let alone what's going on then. And it is true that in 1948 there was this culture of excitement about technology. People clipping on microphones would have been seen as really cool. And people thought that they could finally scientifically understand human behavior such that an election could be predicted, something that has become somewhat commonplace for us now, but at that time had a kind of giddy headiness to it, and the pollsters did in fact believe that they had learned from, there was a big mistake in scientific polling in 1936 that had actually predicted that Roosevelt might lose the election, which we know ended up being significantly untrue. And they thought that in fact they could understand voter behavior. There was an idea floating around in 1948 called Farley's Law, which was named after one of Roosevelt's advisors, who said that all voters make up their minds usually by late July and certainly by Labor Day, and from thenceforth do not change them. Now, we know now how utterly untrue that is. I mean, most voters actually don't make up their minds, if we're to believe, until they actually walk into the voting booth. So this whole notion that there was a predictability to it, and that you could understand that if there was a split in the Democratic Party, that would siphon support off from Truman, whereas what it in fact did, as the gentleman so well put it, is it allowed Truman to run in a particular way, because it meant that on the left with Wallace, his flank was covered. He couldn't be accused of being socialist or communist, so he could go very far to the left. And in terms of the Dixiecrats, as they were known, the Southern segregation states' rights, who withdrew from the party, led by J. Strom Thurmond, who's now the nonagenarian senator from South Carolina. I really just wanted to say that word. When in fact what it did was that it allowed Truman to run, again, guarded from that by consolidating his hold. But it's a wonderful story about the difficulty of predicting.
The guy who went to Mongolia, did he find Shambhala?
I can't. No, I don't know. I mean, there's actually a Nicholas Roerich museum, a private collection by appointment only on Riverside Drive in Manhattan. I know no one has actually ever gone there, but maybe the answer lies there.
Well, paradise is a notoriously elusive destination.
Right.
I'd like to ask a question, perhaps with particular reference to Mr. Wasserman and Mr. Kovic. Back about, I don't know if it was 1920s maybe or 1930s, the Chicago Tribune did some preliminary, exploratory, moderate work towards simplifying English spelling. Are you aware of that?
Yeah.
That was, of course, BC, before computers. I talked on the phone last week with John Madigan, who's the chair of the Tribune Company, and raised this issue with him that with computers you could make all issues, back issues of the Chicago Tribune or the LA Times, all the books in the Library of Congress, etc., that are already digitized or digitizable, available in a simplified spelling, a phonetic spelling system. I'd like to suggest that it would be a good thing to have 90% of 7-year-old kids who could read, at least in the sense of pronouncing accurately anything in the complete works of Shakespeare or anything in your books, although of course they won't understand very much at age 7. But would that be a good thing as far as having more solid understanding of history and truth as close as we can get to it?
Well, I'll take this one. This is easy. No. And I would be resolutely opposed to such a benighted notion as simplification. We live in a culture which is ever more coarse and which refuses mystery and denies the romance of difficulty. And nothing could be more entertaining or more desirable than to hold the specter of unlocking and the code of something very valuable, like those sentiments or truths contained in a book. So I would be utterly opposed to this sort of Esperanto-like project.
I don't know much about computers, but why stop with spelling? If you can move back, it's one of the oldest of science fiction plots, if you can move backwards in time to spell thorough, T-H-R-O-R, whatever. you could move this thing back to improve the rough edges of historical characters and make them smoother and more Plutarchan than...
Hollywood already does that for us. There's no need to do it ourselves. We can morph our way through history.
On the subject of the elusive truths, I'm studying a period in Scandinavian history, and they really didn't write much. They had runes, but that's about it. And I wanted to write a book about a two-paragraph thing that I can only find from Saxo Grammatica's writing. And I wanted to write it as a non-fiction, but I'm not finding very much about it. I was wondering if you had any experience in taking something from really ancient history where there aren't a lot of written records, but it probably happened, or I could reconstruct it as maybe it could have happened, something like that.
Well, you obviously can do it. The question is, what are you doing when you do it? I mean, when I say what are you doing, I mean the kind of label that you want to put on it. In circumstances where you've got just the most scattered and few fragments, and you want to turn this into some kind of full narrative and description, you're going to be making up a lot of stuff. And if you do that, it's not what we recognizably call history today. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm not saying it's not worth doing, but I do think it was Steve at the beginning. Somebody talked about the fuzzy boundary between fiction and history, and it is indeed a lot fuzzier than people sometimes make it out to be, if only in the sense that the narrativizing, the construction, turning things into a plot and a story is a making. That's what fiction is. Something made. The historian, as much as the novelist, makes in this sense. But we do have a rule. Just you don't make stuff up. You don't create characters. This is what Edmund Morris did. No. I mean, to know, and it was really kind of silly because I don't think anything good happened as a result of it. I don't think the book just got trashed and he was made to look silly. But the rule we have, and I think it's a good rule insofar as when something is marketed as history, there is kind of an implicit statement with it. I didn't make any of this up. And to the extent that you're in a genre or dealing with a kind of situation where the only way you can write a book is to make a lot of stuff up, well, fine, go ahead. I don't think I would want to call it history.
It seems to me you'd only be limited by your own talent. If I had to make a list of the 25 great books of the century, on that list certainly would appear Marguerite Yourcenar's surpassingly marvelous book, The Memoirs of Hadrian. Well, Hadrian actually never wrote his memoirs, but she did it for him. And they are so well imagined from the inside out that it has the force of the purest, most remarkable discovery of an actually existing document, but she made everything up in it.
Orville, I was wondering, when you write about a place like Tibet, where so much of the history is written by either the people, either the Chinese or the English, or people who conquered, and so much of the history of what might be the alternative is somewhat lost. How do you do that?
Well, paradoxically, in the case of Tibet, many of the accounts that were left behind over the last 250 years or so are by people who never got there, by people who may have skirted off the edge, seen it from afar, and it bears out the old saw that some things are better imagined than described. And some of the most powerful imagery I think that we have is imagery that's somehow rooted in real place, but in actuality is embellished way beyond what it deserves by our own imaginations. And it's a very perilous territory for a historian. And but one that's quite interesting once you treat these kinds of accounts as a kind of a history, because as I think, well, maybe it was you said, once it gets in the system, it's like a computer virus. It has an effect. And it does tend to create real news, because then the papers start commenting. Talk Magazine does an article, and you're off to the races.
And I think, of course, in an earlier epoch, in some sense, the discovery of the so-called New World was for Europeans a bit like what you described Tibet in a later epoch was received as a place of fevered imagination in which accounts of travels in the New World and what those travelers encountered were very often made up whole cloth by people who had never, in fact, gone to the Western world. And these accounts were widely circulated and had the force of a kind of truth, and indeed became part of the story itself.
I mean, to wit, Marco Polo, which people now begin to wonder whether it's real or not. And then one has only to think of the South Seas. I mean, these were largely imagined places which were written about with great authority by many people who had only a flirting acquaintance with them.
We'll take the next question.
I'd like to ask Dr. Novak to hopefully comment. Karl Popper would say that truth is never reachable, but we work for approximations of truth. In science, that's a very workable approach. When you were discussing the inapplicability of truth to history and the danger of getting into relativism, and I'm wondering if applying the Popper criterion of disprovability to history is useful in what you're...
Popper didn't think so. That's not decisive. I mean, we don't necessarily have the last word about the implications of our own thought. Just to I'm going to give a short course in philosophy of science here, but what Popper's interesting contribution to thinking about science is, everybody had said what you want to do is confirm a theory, and he demonstrated pretty well you can't ever confirm a theory. What you can do is you can disconfirm a theory, you can falsify a theory, and to the extent that a theory has resisted attempts at falsification, and this of course assumes that a lot of people have been trying to do this, then you are confident in believing it until probably that inevitable day when somebody is going to come up with something wrong with it, and then you'll have to try on something else.
This is the end of side one. Please turn over your tape and continue listening on side two.
Historical narratives are simply not subject to falsification in the same way that scientific theories which offer predictions. The law of gravity says that if I hold this up and let go of it, bang, it's going to move toward the center of the Earth at an accelerating at 32 feet per second. And if I let go of this and instead of falling down and sort of flew up around the room, whoops, there goes the theory of gravity. It's been falsified. We are entitled, in Popper's view, to continue to believe in it because it hasn't been falsified. But you think about how one would falsify a narrative it really can't be done. You can offer an alternative narrative which people on a variety of grounds may find preferable. And really it's a long list of grounds. And I want to underline what I said before. It's not that one is as good as another. All kinds of criteria. Does it get a lot of facts wrong, or does it seem to have them mostly right? Are the attributions of motives and patterns of behavior, do these sound plausible to people based on their readers' understanding of how people act? All kinds of other criteria, but they're not. It can't falsify one, and that's why it doesn't work.
Yeah, I was also intrigued because Popper also says the smaller the fact, the more, the easier to work with. You can disprove it very easily. When you're writing a very large history, like you referred to, it's unfalsifiable because it's too large, too many facts. A very small
a sentence can be falsified. Right. When David Irving utters the sentence, "There were no operative gas chambers at Auschwitz," this can be falsified. Or they say all kinds of evidence can be presented and adduced to show that there were indeed gas chambers at Auschwitz. There were indeed hundreds of thousands of people killed there. So I don't want to have a kind of grammatical fetishism, but I do think that one does well to keep in mind the distinction between the nature of sentences which assert things and the nature of big, lumpy, synthetic narratives, which are by no means simply a collection of factual statements.
Thank you.
Proposition. History is the accumulation over time of successful public relations campaigns.
Yes.
Yes and no.
More and more.
Yes, but.
Napoleon said that history is a lie agreed upon. And he was one of the only epigrammatists who was in a position to enforce this.
We are a species hopelessly devoted to seeking meaning through metaphor and then arguing about whether we got it right.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to what I think are a couple of the biggest pieces of the conversation that historians have been having about the elusiveness of truth for the last, say, 30 years. And one is, how do you tell the history of people who haven't left obvious traces of their lives in the historical record? And the other is whether or not the historian, him or herself, should enter the narrative and sort of actively break down the illusion of objectivity.
It's interesting, in the case of Tibet, the Tibetans didn't leave a lot of records of their own, but that didn't stop anybody because the West had its own army of fact finders. And so it was a curious situation where the people themselves never got to write their history for the world. Someone else wrote it for them, and they had a certain kind of lens on as they did it.
On the first, writing, the history of people where there's not much to go on, I think the way to do it is very, very modestly. That is to say, with full upfront acknowledgement of just how tentative any kind of generalization has been. This is hard because the posture of omniscience is one that we're all fond of. But I think particularly when much of it has to be guesswork, I think that's okay precisely to the extent that you're upfront about it being guesswork. Just very briefly on the second part of it, the narrator or the historian coming in comes in too much, it becomes obtrusive, self-celebratory, narcissistic, all that good stuff. On the other hand, I do think it is at least my practice not to disguise from the reader the fact that I'm coming from a certain place with certain assumptions, and that's a kind of warning label, if you will, to somebody who is not interested in what somebody who's coming from that place has to say.
I'll be brief because we want to get to the last. I mean, Peter Novick has written, one of the better books about this whole issue about objectivity and the difficulty of it, so I won't presume. But it is true that, historians in the Western context, one, history is kind of a Western thing, the idea of a linear narrative that unfolds. But the other thing is this kind of the fetish for the piece of paper. The document is truth, and other forms of knowledge, as they may have been transmitted over time, are of a lesser value. And part of the difficulty of that is if you start to question that, you kind of question history as this thing about the past that's supposed to be true. And I don't know if there's any way around it. I mean, personally, I try not to worry too much about these questions and try to approach what I do with something that approaches a consensus of rigor, but also not to over-fetishize, the written word on a piece of paper that has survived, because, as we know, that too can have its vast amounts of inaccuracies and difficulties and inaccuracies, and not to become so enthralled to that you start removing the realm of other information that's always available to us, and the test of, does this make sense in light of all the other things we can know? I mean, I think at a certain point, if there is no record whatsoever of something 3,000 years ago, then you're left kind of being Gene Aul and writing the Clan of the Cave Bear and just letting it be. But
if I a footnote to a footnote, I know that historians disparage anecdotal history, but nobody ever told historical novelists about that. Some years ago, when I was spending a sabbatical year in Ireland, the University of California, Berkeley, was offered for sale the building in which Bishop Berkeley, the great philosopher, had been born. And they sent over a team to examine the feasibility of this. I was living in Ireland at the time, and so I joined them. And there was nothing there really to look at except some crumbled stones. It had once been a tower house, but it wasn't much anymore. And the idea was to build this into a house of graduate studies, which seemed to me to be putting a lot of strain on the available material, but they were very serious about it, and I slipped away lest I reveal my feelings. And I was walking down a path, and from the other direction was coming an elderly Irish farmer, and we stopped and engaged in desultory meteorological speculation. And he said, "You're thinking of buying Bishop Berkeley birthplace, aren't you?" And I said, "No such thing." We had been told to be very circumspect. No, right? Just interested in Tarquin Codestone. He said, Bishop Berkeley wasn't born there. Bishop Berkeley was born about 7 miles away from here in a place called Parsonstown. And I said, I have dealt with locals before. That's very interesting. And he said, it was all written up in the Kilkenny Archaeological Society in 1907. And I said, oh, all right. And I got back to Dublin and looked it up. And the man was absolutely right. But that had often you never know who is telling the literal truth about something. It doesn't always be a professor.
It rarely is.
Alas, we have run out of time, but we will entertain questions after hours, as it were. And on this sobering note, which ought to puncture any notion of hubris when it comes to history, I thank you for listening to us.
This is the end of tape number 42 and concludes this session.